Hello, good evening. I'm David Bagnall, curator with the Frank Lloyd Wright Trust, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Trust's lecture series, Frank Lloyd Wright, Origins and Influences. This program is made possible by the generous support of the Terra Foundation for American Art. And before we begin tonight's program, I'd like you to, if possible, silence your cell phones. We're recording the lecture tonight. Taking Frank Lloyd Wright and his Chicago years as its starting point, the Origins and Influences series considers the influences upon and connections between progressive architects and designers at the dawn of the 20th century. In support of the series, the Trust's travel program, Travel Wright, offers an immersive experience that expands upon many of the themes encountered in the lectures. In timely fashion for the topic of tonight's talk, Travel Wright Japan, the Architect's Eastern Vision, is an 11-day trip that follows Wright's own travels in Japan. And the trip will take place in May of 2015, and more information can be found on the Trust's website, flwright.org. Tonight, we're joined by Kevin Nute, Professor of Architecture at the University of Oregon. Kevin earned his doctorate at Cambridge University, and his thesis was published as Frank Lloyd Wright and Japan. The book received the 1994 International Architectural Monograph Award from the American Institute of Architects. After teaching at Cambridge, he accepted a Japan Foundation Research Fellowship at the University of Tokyo. The following year, he was appointed Professor of Architecture at the Muroran Institute of Technology. In October 2000, he joined the University of Oregon. Kevin's research focuses on visual qualities of built environments that resonate directly with building users. He's the author of Place, Time, and Being in Japanese Architecture, published in 2004, and is about to publish his first electronic book, Vital, Using the Sun, Wind, and Rain to Bring Buildings and Sustainability to Life. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Nute.
Thank you. I'd like to go on that tour. Can I get a discount? So I'm hoping this is going to... all right, there we go. Thank you for coming. I'm extremely pleased to be back in Chicago. It's been quite a while. Chicago was a very different place, this part of Chicago, 25 years ago when I was starting work on Wright in Japan. So a lot has happened to me and to Chicago. And I've learned a lot more, I think, about the relationship between Wright's work and Japanese art and architecture in that time. So it really is a pleasure, and everybody says that, but it genuinely is for me to share that. Some of the old stuff, but some of the more recent explorations. I was saying to David, I've probably crammed in far too much, so I'm going to try to go quite quickly. I was also saying to Celeste that I don't regard myself primarily as an historian. I'm a designer. So I'm a little bit sloppy when it comes to history and dates and things, because I'm far more interested in what are the ideas that were being... I can do it, but it's not my forte. So it's really from the perspective of a designer that I'm always thinking and writing. So let's start with the well-known. This is probably, almost certainly, the first Japanese building, authentic Japanese building that Wright would have seen. The Hoden, the Phoenix Hall in Jackson Park. So this is the structure at the north end. Nothing left of that now, but this building, unlike most of the White City all around it, was not demolished after the 1893 exposition, but it remained on its site as a source of inspiration, not just to Wright, but to many others, for almost 50 years, actually a little more, until somebody burned it down in the middle of the Pacific War, sadly. Otherwise, we'd still have it. But this was not just a temporary kind of flash across Wright's radar. It was a constant source of inspiration that he could have gone down, and I'm pretty sure did, and reevaluate and take apart mentally. So it's one of the famous influences right on his doorstep. And its effect on Wright's work is somewhat less clear. There's no immediate change in Wright's work after 1893, and there's no immediate change even after his first visit to Japan in 1905. It's much more complicated. Ideas would be taken in, but they would come out often decades later. But I want to look at or reprise some of that before I get on to the main subject of what I wanted to talk about, really, which is what's the connection between Wright's well-known love of Japanese art, woodblock prints in particular, and his own architecture. Everybody knows Wright collected woodblock prints. Everybody knows that Wright felt like he was designing this thing called organic architecture. I'd like to talk about what the potential link between the two are. So here's the Houden up close. It's made of these three parts. It was an unusual building. It was designed specially for the exposition to showcase three different architectural styles within the interiors. But it was the plan of the building more than anything that I think might, and I again emphasize might, have had an influence on Wright. And it wasn't until, ironically, Wright went back to Japan to build the Imperial Hotel. And the sort of story of the Imperial Hotel building was embellished by Wright, as everything else was. But he had the inside track. He didn't sort of win a competition. Here's a set of drawings of the Houden published in the Inland Architect, the Midwestern architectural magazine, in 1893. So here's the tripartite plan. And here's the plan of the Houden, together with the completed plan of the Imperial Hotel. And obviously there's no way to prove this, but it looks like basically an extrusion. It's got this central spine and these two wings pushed apart, which created these courtyard enclosed gardens, which happened to be extremely useful in downtown Tokyo. So you could be outside, but you were still protected from the sort of surrounding urban environment. So it fit very well, and Hayashi, the manager of the hotel, apparently warned Wright that if you behave properly and don't do anything too outrageous, you'll probably get the job. So this building, basing the Imperial Hotel on the Houden, which is based on the Hodo, and the Hodo, I believe, still appears on the Japanese 10 yen coin, is this kind of icon of Japanese history. So it would have made a lot of sense to have done something rather conservative in a rather un-Wrightian way, a completely bilaterally symmetrical plan, which was unusual in his work. But more probably interesting, I think, than the actual structure of the Houden was the person who wrote the catalogue describing it. His name's spelled wrong, but this is Okakura Kakuzo, Okakura Tenshin, another icon of Japanese literature, and the author of the Book of Tea. So, isn't that strange? So Wright, of course, quotes the Book of Tea in relation to Lao Tzu and space being the reality of a building, not the materiality. And this was the beginning, well, part of a series of personal connections that are at the heart of Wright's relationship to Japan. They were not coincidental. The Japanese art community was tiny and everybody knew everybody. So if you know one member of that group, you knew them all, or at least you knew their work around 100 years ago. So Okakura's Book of Tea, first published in English, not in Japanese, it was only later published in Japanese. So it's published for a foreign audience to interpret not tea ostensibly, but Japanese aesthetics. And of course, Wright owned a copy, knew of Okakura's work. And Okakura was one of, so here's Okakura in a rather different Western outfit, together with his colleagues, Ernest Fenollosa, his mentor, mentor and student. Fenollosa, for those who don't know then, went to Japan as a sort of new graduate in philosophy from Harvard to teach the future leaders of Japan the basis of Western philosophy, ended up learning the basis of Japanese art and wanting to come back and teach that to the West. So the tables kind of got turned, that he started off as Fenollosa's teacher at Tokyo University, but Okakura quickly became essentially, although he would never have said it, Fenollosa's teacher in Japanese art. The other two gentlemen, this is Edward Morse. This is probably Bigelow. It's never been categorically confirmed, but this is definitely Edward Morse, even better known in terms of Japanese architecture for this book, Japanese Homes and Their Surroundings, published in 1886. 1886, so before Wright was anything like well known. This book on which minutely dissects the residential Japanese building then, because Morse was a scientist. He went to Japan, rather like Fenollosa, to do one thing, to study mollusks, and got very, very distracted by, amongst other things, architecture. So he publishes this book. Here's one of the houses that Morse described staying in, and he described how convenient it was for the owner of the house to invite them all to stay at a moment's notice just by removing all the fusuma, the non-structural screens. Here's Frank Lloyd Wright's Life house, published. It was a prototype house published for Life magazine in the 1930s. And it's different, and yet there are these projections that actually line up with what are external bathrooms in the original. But for me, the kind of clincher here, because I know how architects work, is that this timber veranda, the engawa, this is actually a pool. Now, who in their right minds would render a pool with that kind of hatching? Unless, of course, they were looking at that when they were doing it, right? Why would you render water with a right-angled miter in it, right? Very odd, right? I can't prove this, but it's the kind of thing that architects do, right? Wright, when he first goes to Japan in 1905 with Ward Willits, is one of his clients, the Ward Willitses then, he apparently famously ignored them and went off on his own, but one of the places we know he visited was Nikko. This is the Nikko Toshogu, the most famous building in Nikko. And Masami Tanagawa actually discovered that Wright's signature is in the Kanaya Hotel guest book in April of 1905, I believe. It's not the Toshogu, though, that I think had the biggest influence. The Toshogu was roundly criticized by Bruno Taut, the German modernist, who described it in very unflattering terms in comparison to Katsura. Katsura was held up as a precursor for modernism, right, in another culture. And this was roundly dismissed by Taut as this sort of decorated Japanese Baroque, he called it, right, hated it. Wright was able to get past that, and especially in the lesser known building. This is a sort of twin building to the Toshogu, the Nikko Taiyuin. And I won't go into too much detail, but it's made out of three parts. There's the sacred enclosure, there's the area for the secular worshippers, and then there's an area for priests to connect the two. So it's a gongen, three-part plan. And you can see that obviously this building looks nothing like anything that Frank Lloyd Wright would have done. Except, if you look at the plan, there's the plan, there's Unity Temple. This is an early version of Unity Temple. If you look, sorry, these are poorly copied, but this is an early version where Wright had a central staircase in the same location, and he scribbled it out. So if you go to Unity Temple now, the stairs are on the periphery, but the plan is great. And of course, Wright, in typical design fashion, post-rationalizes a lot of these decisions and takes credit, which of course he deserves, right? This is not copying, I can tell you. It's not at all. But he does kind of go over the top a little bit, and it's a rare thing for him to describe a design process in any detail. But he did with the Unity Temple, and he said, that there was a reason that this is a Sunday school, this is a sacred space. It's a perfect replica of the gongen, right? It all made logical sense, but here's the inspiration, at least of the plan. Of course, in 3 dimensions, it looks completely different. It's a reinforced concrete building. But one of the things that Wright described was, or took credit for, was it had to be this long building, right? He wanted to put this down here, and he wanted the entrance here because the streetcar on Lake Street was so noisy that he couldn't have the entrance here. Well, if you look at this, you can see why the entrance was here. There's another very good reason. This was the shape of the site. There's only one way to get that gongen plan on that site, which is to have it elongated. So the entrance was always going to be a long way. Now, again, it's not a critique, this is the way designers work, right? And very often they don't even know the exact reason, but they're looking for positives. You know, a lot of these things happen because of it was an appropriate analogy, right? So he took that ball and he ran with it, right? And made a merit out of that situation. But that was not the primary, in my view, the primary inspiration was the Nikko Taiyu Inn. Can't be proved. None of this can be proved, really. One of the other buildings that he may or may not have seen, very famous, the staggered section of the pagoda Yakshiji in Nara. Most pagodas don't have this section where you've got a large complete roof and then a partial roof. So it has this staggered section. Well, where have you seen that before? In the Price Tower, in the Johnson's Research Tower. Okay, it's a different structure, in case anybody's wondering. Structurally, this is a genuine cantilever. This is far more complex. The central core, it is structural, but it's earthquake more than a cantilever. The prime purpose of that central post, in this case, is though not structural. It's marking the location of Buddhist relics, okay, at the foot that were buried here. The first Unitarian church in Madison, famously, Wright describes it as based on an analogy of praying hands, and it's a great analogy. I don't think I'm the first to have pointed out, though, that there are buildings in Japan, and once you start looking at this, you can very easily you can find a Japanese source for anything and everything. And if I was looking at French architecture or Turkish architecture, I could probably prove, you know. So you have to be very careful. You have to kind of, and my attitude to all of this is I'll put it out there, and presumably there's a spectrum from I'm completely convinced to get out of here. There's no way that's true, right? So, and I'm perfectly happy for people to make up their own minds. I'm not, you know, and I've changed my mind, you know, or my mind over the years. You know, some of this I would say, well, you know, there are Beaux-Arts sorts for all of that stuff, you know. But there's, at one end of the spectrum, things are a little more certain. So this is probably less certain, but I think it's worth mentioning that this type of building, the famous buildings in Shirakawa, in Gifu Prefecture, these farmhouses for the silkworm manufacturers, are called gasho. Gasho means pray. So praying style houses of this nature, who knows? You know, clearly they're not the same building, right? And you or I could look at this building for 100 years and still not produce that, right? As Wright said, you know, a spoon can be in soup for 100 years and never taste the soup. Well, that's what we're talking about here, is that it took somebody of Wright's genius to take these sources and put them together. And they're not just Japanese, this is just one of many. Here's another one, potentially. This is the staircase leading to the Flying Cloud Pavilion at Nishihonganji in Kyoto. And so it's in a pond, so you were meant to approach it by boat across the pond and then come up these steps. Well, here's the steps down to the river, down to the creek at Falling Water. Okay, so who knows? This is Clay Lancaster who found that analogy. So, okay, to the main topic. So how does Japanese art, I've talked about the architecture, and when I first heard of Wright's relationship to Japan, frankly, I thought, no pun intended, sorry, that the Japanese art stuff was a bit of a smokescreen to hide the fact that he was probably looking at the architecture. Well, he was looking at the architecture, but the Japanese art was a powerful, genuine influence, and I don't think it's, to this day, really fully understood. I'm not saying I fully understand it, but it's not well understood then. So that's really what I wanted to talk about primarily this evening, not so much the architecture, Japanese architecture, but how does Japanese art, specifically the woodblock print, how does that influence, how does that relate to American organic buildings? And I think that's a relationship worth looking at. So here's how Wright described it, right? He completely, in his autobiography, says, this is the way I saw Japan. I saw Yedo, right, the Edo period name. I saw it through the eyes of the printmakers, right? Because he knew it, at least he thought he knew it, through the prints before he ever set foot. So he was probably collecting prints at least a decade, probably more, before he first set foot in Japan in March of 1905. So he was steeped in this imagery of a Japan that by and large didn't really exist. It was rapidly modernizing, but this was the image. This was always going to be Wright's image of Japan. So he saw it through the eyes of the Japanese print artists. And he comes back and, very quickly in 1906, just across the road, he shows his first collection of Hiroshige prints at the Art Institute. This is that collection, and here's the catalog. Okay. And then 2 years later, in 1908, he does a much more professional job, and he's an avid collector by now. But he's been at this now for more than 10 years, 20 years probably, interested in Japanese woodblock prints. And Wright was so obsessed with architecture that I don't think he, put it this way, he was not somebody who would have gone and played golf, right? Architecture was his complete being. Japanese art was not a hobby, right? It had to be more than that. It had to be something more central for him to have given as much of his time and money to it. And it was, in my view, and I'm not the only one. So he famously gave these talks about Japanese prints to the apprentices at Taliesin, and I don't know, I'm not sure if they all really understood. Maybe some of them did. Wright was an architect, he wasn't a scholar, right? Probably would have been insulted to have been called that. So it's quite difficult, I think, to explain some of this stuff. Well, one of the influences was very direct and very obvious. This is a famous Hiroshige print of the temple at Asakusa. And here's one of Wright's own photographs. I believe it's of Chionin Temple in Kyoto. But look at the way he's composing the photograph. It's a direct kind of influence of the foreground object. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, how that affects both Wright's renderings, but also his architecture. But what about the organic nature? What is this kind of slippery word, organic, right? Which has been interpreted in so many ways that it almost lost meaning. So Wright describes the Japanese print, in this way, that it was this organic thing. Now, it is a flexible word, and I'm certainly not going to say that my kind of description is exhaustive, but I would like to at least have a shot at explaining how I can see the relationship between that term, that analogy with the organism, with the living organism, and hard architecture. Okay. The Japanese print, very unusual for an architect to do, to publish a book, and his first book is about not just art, but a foreign art, Japanese art. So the Japanese print is really, between the lines, an essay on aesthetics. And again, if I'm right, and who knows, I don't think Wright would have written something like that as a hobby, right? It had to go to the heart of his own discipline. But it seems to me that this essay, The Nature of Fine Art, published in 1896 by Ernest Fenollosa, the chap I mentioned earlier, had a profound influence on the Japanese print and Wright's entire connection to Japan. Fenollosa, I mentioned, was trained in philosophy, read Kant and Hegel, knew about Herbert Spencer, the notion of the organic, right? So he was studying Japanese art. So here's a connection in the person of Ernest Fenollosa, connecting the notion of the organism, which was popular in European philosophy, both German and Anglo. And Spencer, of course, was talking in the US at the end of the 19th century, sort of popular kind of social Darwinist kind of topic, based on an analogy with the organism. So The Lotus is published, but how would Wright necessarily know of this obscure publication on what really is about the nature of art, but it's coming from Japanese art? Well, sorry about the quality of this, but here's Ernest Fenollosa, and here's Ernest Fenollosa. Here's Joseph Lyman Silsby. Joseph Lyman Silsby was Wright's first employer in Chicago, the shingle-style architect that he was working for before he went to Adler and Sullivan. Okay, so here he is. Here's the young Frank Lloyd Wright, dropped out of engineering school, moves to Chicago, and within 10 years becomes, less than that, an expert, a world-known expert on Japanese woodblock prints. That doesn't happen by accident, but it does happen if you're working for the first cousin of the leading expert on Japanese art in the world at the time, and that's probably Ernest Fenollosa, because he had the inside track. He had Okakura, he had all the connections in Japan to get into the temples, to be shown. So he was really at the cutting edge. And this guy is coming to visit his cousin in Edgewater occasionally. When he comes to Chicago, he stayed with Joseph Silsby. And it's my hunch, we know Fenollosa is mentioned at least a couple of times in Wright's autobiography. And he mentions that on one of his trips home, he brought many prints, some of which Wright made his own. So Fenollosa comes home, he gives prints to Silsby. Silsby either gives them to Wright, or Wright actually met Fenollosa, we don't know. But he certainly knew of his work in Japan and describes him as basically single-handedly saving traditional Japanese art. A bit of an exaggeration, but basically true. So that's the connection. It was not what so much as who Wright knew. He ended up working for a pretty good but not exceptional shingle-style architect who had exceptional connections with Japanese art. That's how this all begins. Okay, a bit of a change of gear. Okay, it looks like a geometric form, and it is. But this goes to the heart of, how can, if I mention organic to my students, they think of amoeba, and strange, and I have to kind of stop that. Not many of Wright's buildings look like that, right? And they look a lot more like this. Well, this is a diagram, and it'll become clearer why, of an organic whole. And it's really pretty simple. They have a family resemblance, all of these forms. They're individually expressed, the parts, but they're all connected. And if you think about your own body or any living organism then, right, that's the nature of an organ, that it's specialized. The hand does certain things, but the hand cannot exist without the other parts. You chop a hand off, pretty gruesome idea, right? Not only is the hand useless, but the body that's left is somewhat less able, right? So that's the nature of an organic whole, that all the parts have specific functions, but they're all, so they're usually formally differentiated. We have things like fingers and hands and arms, which we can see, but they're all actually formally interdependent. Okay, they're all connected back, and they all make sense visually as a result. So this really goes to the heart of what I think Wright understood as an organic whole, right? This set of individually expressed parts that are actually interdependent. And if you think about democracy, what is that if it isn't everybody having the maximum freedom of individual expression consistent with a coherent whole, so it doesn't all fall apart? So there's an analogy there that Wright makes himself, that organic society was a democratic society, right? As much freedom as possible, but you still have to be connected back to the whole, right? You're not this loose cannon out there just working for yourself, right? So here's Wright himself, and this kind of sums up, I think, at least my understanding of what he was talking about, this sense of interlock, right, of everything being connected. Of course, that's a cliche now, but 100 years ago, it was not. This notion that all these parts have temporary individual expression, but they're all actually connected at the same time. It's sort of this mutual push and pull between the whole and the part. Okay, so it seems to me that Wright interpreted that idea, that single idea of the individual expression and interdependence of parts in art as an aesthetic whole, a sort of visual, formal thing, in society, as I've explained, and that comes from Herbert Spencer's notion of the organism. Spencer, the British philosopher. Louis Sullivan mentions Spencer, and almost certainly Wright knew of that idea. So Spencer made this analogy between organisms and societies, that in a primitive organism like an amoeba, right? If you chop it in two, or so I'm told, I've never done this, right? You've got two amoeba, they don't really care, right? Nobody's asked the amoeba, I guess, but if you take a more evolved form, like a human being, and you chop it in two, it's a problem, right? And the problem is functional differentiation, because with functional differentiation, if you lose a part, that's a major problem. If all the parts do all the jobs, like in an amoeba, and I'm no biologist, then it doesn't really matter. Same in a society. In a primitive society, everybody does everything. So you go and hunt, you make your own house, you make your own clothes, right? You're completely independent. As societies, according to Spencer, become more sophisticated, people specialize. So if the lights go out tomorrow, I don't know how to make power. I could probably rub sticks together, right? But we are incredibly interdependent because we're so specialized. Spencer makes this analogy between the evolution of organisms and the evolution of societies. So it wasn't a huge leap to make a connection between the notion of the organic whole, of interdependent, differentiated but interdependent parts, and society, and then the environment, of course, the more obvious one of the organism and its immediate environment and that interdependent symbiosis. So that's what I'd like to talk about. So interdependence and individual expression, then let's have a look at that in the woodblock print and then in some of Wright's buildings. So here's a book that Wright describes. It's a basic drawing book, the kind of thing that we would take for granted these days, but in 1812, when Hokusai, one of Wright's favorite Japanese print artists, published it, it was pretty unusual. And for me, what this says is, this explains how you can go from these mechanical geometrical shapes to, quotes, an organic form, okay? And look at the way that the forms, okay, they overlap, they're interdependent, they're individually expressed, but they overlap. So overlap and interlock become the kind of formal mechanisms by which this idea gets expressed in Wright's work. Okay. Interdependence expressed as overlap or interlock between spaces or forms. So let's look at it in terms of forms, right? Famously, David Wright House, here's the carpet, and look at these forms. This is organic decoration. Well, people go, what? How's that organic? Well, if you think about it as an organic whole, in which the parts are individually expressed, but they are interlocking, interdependent, right? None of these forms is out there floating in space. Ever notice that? They're all connected back to the mother form. Wright does that in his plans. Here's the Rolf Jester project. Here's the Boomer House. Okay, so the individual forms, everything is consistent. Everything is taken from a family of forms. Today we would call them fractals, right? But it's not just that, it's the relationship of those parts. It's not just a replication of forms, it's the fact that those forms, just as in our bodies, right? Where is the line between the hand and the arm? Well, there's a kind of gray area where, right, you're in between the two, right? You can't exactly disconnect them. This is Arthur Wesley Dow, a close colleague and friend of Ernest Fenollosa's. They met at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts when Fenollosa had become the museum of the Japanese collection there. And Dow was trained in Paris, formally in traditional Western art, but became fascinated by Japanese art. And in 1899, he publishes this book, Composition, which is really, because he was graphically talented, a graphic interpretation of Ernest Fenollosa's philosophy of art, right? Largely based on the notion of the organic whole. So we have Fenollosa wanting to come back and explain to the West, America in particular, that all art was about expression of organic wholes, right? He described in The Nature of Fine Art, all art as basically musical in character, that it may not have a useful purpose, right, that is easily identifiable, but every art form, he argued in The Nature of Fine Art, to be art had to have this formal, purely visual then, or not purely visual, purely formal characteristic, so that if you didn't understand it, you could still appreciate it, And that's a classic description of the way the West looked at Japanese art. You know, the cliche at the time was that you could take a Japanese print, put it up on your wall, upside down, not understand any of the cultural references, and it's still beautiful because it has this underlying, and it's the equivalent of going to a classical concert and not understanding the German references of when the thing was, but still, it's communicating to you across time and space. There's something intrinsic to its form that is communicating, and that's not only, in my view, the way Japanese art was and still is so popular amongst Westerners who don't necessarily understand its cultural context. Doesn't matter. And it's true of Wright's work. Wright, of all architects, is head and shoulders more popular than any other outside of this country. And I don't just mean in Europe, right? In countries that are not supposed to understand. Well, if you don't, understanding can be visual understanding then. So Wright's work has that quality. It's one reason I think that it's still so popular. It still resonates because it's not dependent on a knowledge of its context. That's the nature of the organic whole, that it has this formal quality. So Arthur Dow publishes this book. Here are some of the organic line ideas in composition. Composition became very popular as an art teaching text in the early couple of decades of the century. And you'll see the connection with that organic whole that I showed you earlier of the interlocking, individually expressed but interlocking, interdependent parts. That's how they're organic wholes. And these are Dow's words, and before Dow's words, they were Ernest Fenellose's words. So here's the storehouse, the concrete textile block house. Here's the textile block pattern. Here are two of Dow's organic line ideas, which look like they've been brought together to make that. So this explains to me how that can be described as organic. It's not an amoeba, but it's organic. This is the Millard house, La Miniatura. There's the textile block pattern. Again, two different organic line ideas from composition. I can't prove that, but they're very similar. And it certainly explains how Wright could describe that as organic decoration. He described this, the decoration on the soffit of the eaves of the Imperial Hotel as organic decoration, and was roundly criticized, especially in this country, as being ignorant of the context. Well, those critics didn't understand that this was meant to be transcultural, right? This was like saying, you know, a flower is beautiful. A flower, you know, a rose is a rose is a rose, right? That it transfers, apart from its cultural associations, right? A rose is beautiful in Tokyo as it is in Chicago, as it is in London. And that's the nature of this, that these were meant to be universal, right? Wright was fully conscious that he didn't understand that culture as well as he could, but ironically, the Japanese, at least one Japanese critic said, we love it, we understand it. So, again, Dow's organic line ideas. This is the life house that I showed you a bit earlier in relation to Morse. And what I've tried to show here is the way that some of the spaces interlock. So in other words, if you take some of these interlocking patterns and you erase the areas, the walls where they interlock, you can very quickly reach a plan which is at the heart of Wright's architectural space, where you have not conventional corners, but spaces like this, where, well, the corner would be here, but if you stand in here, you can effectively be in two spaces at the same time. So this is the architectural, three-dimensional interpretation of the organic whole, or the interdependence, the interlock, okay? Two independently expressed parts, but they are interdependent. And if you erase, as I say, the overlap in the plan, you end up with that interlocking space that Wright made famous. Much later, I mean, long after Wright was dead, I looked at a contemporary, this was contemporary back in the 80s, interpretation of organic or biological form, actually. Sorry, the text is poor, but according to this biological text, then there were four characteristics of biological form. Traditive inheritance, which we would understand as a sort of fractal relationship. family relationship of form, interdependence, right? Hierarchy, right? Different levels of scale, and then standard parts. And they're all there. In other words, Arthur Dow's organic line ideas passed a modern test of biological order, which I find pretty amazing and was done 100 years earlier. A different interpretation of interdependence. Landscape mimicry. Well, what does that mean? Well, things like this. This is Wright describing in his autobiography, right, the fact that the pagodas look like pine trees. Okay, well, here's Hokusai changing actually the form of Fuji, right, to fit. Right, this is the opposite. Right, this is the antithesis of what Wright's describing. He changed the form of Fuji unashamedly. Here's Wright's description. Right, Hokusai played fast and loose with the form of Fuji to make a beautiful idea, right? And Wright says, hell, why couldn't I, right? So he's changing nature, his representation of nature to fit the contour of the temple form in the Saksa. Here's Wright, of course, saying, here's a prairie house. Here's a house that reflects its environment. Here's an architectural organism that is part of, a product of its place in the world. If it were somewhere else, it would look different, right? Just like an organism. A bit later, here's the cactus house, right, where it's very clear what the relationship is, that Wright is overtly mimicking the characteristic landscape. Right? You can see what he's stretching towards. He's seeing the building as an organism in its environment, as a product of its environment, that it assimilates its environment, mimics its environment, that belongs to its environment. Belonging is very, very important, right? Not just for organisms, right? For all of us. Here's the fir tree house, and there it is. Okay, I think it's better as a drawing, frankly, but shouldn't say that, should I? Permeable boundaries, and we're getting to the core, and that's a good thing because I need to wrap up fairly soon of what I wanted to talk about. Permeable boundaries, that really goes to the heart of this relationship. So dissolving the picture frame, I talked a little bit, I touched on the renderings. Here's the Winslow rendering. Here's one of Hiroshige's 100 famous views of Edo. And you can see he's using the wisteria, or is it? No, sorry, that's a willow tree, right? Here it's a wisteria. To frame the main subject, right, of in place of a conventional frame, right? The sidewalk is kind of merged into the frame. There's no frame at all up here. In other words, that kind of gilded frame that you'd see around a Renaissance painting or whatever, right? It's gone. That thing that says, oh, by the way, I've done my level best to represent three-dimensional space and to fool the brain into thinking that this is real. And now I'm going to put a frame around it to tell you this is a lie. Okay? That's what a classical frame does. Well, here Wright describes how the prints didn't do that, especially Hiroshige's vertical prints, right? These are landscape done in portrait format. And the effect is to make you feel like you're really part of the space. You're in that space. There's no frame saying, well, this is pictorial space. You're out there in real space. That separation is gone. You can see where I'm going, right? I hope, right? He's dissolving spatially a boundary. In this case, it's pictorial, but it very soon gets architectural. Here we are. This is Unity Temple again. Okay, again, the frame is almost gone. It's like, well, we're in the space, right? There is no frame disconnecting us. And he's using these elements of the landscape to kind of take the place of the frame, to give us some idea of spatial depth, right? That we're obviously closer to the tree, but there is no frame. There's no artificial frame, right? Part of the scene is being used as the frame, and that tricks us into thinking that we're there. Here's a famous rendering of the De Rhodes house by Marion Mahoney, who did a lot of these renderings. You probably can't read it, but I'll read it for you. It says, very cheekily, drawn by Mahoney after Frank Lloyd Wright, after Hiroshige. So there he is. He's admitting it, right? Totally admitting it, and being extremely disrespectful to Mahoney as well at the same time. That's another story. Here's Hokusai in one of his printed books, and he's breaking the frame in another way. He's saying Fuji's big. It's really big, so big you can't keep it in the page, right? Here's Hiroshige, not to be undone, copies him unashamedly a few years later, right? Here's Frank Lloyd Wright a few years later, unashamedly, right? This is the Huntington Hartford project, which is raised up, and here's the horizon, and the building just bursts through it, right? So there are many of these graphic devices, including this use of notan, this kind of darkening. That was something that was seen in the prints, right? But it's the architectural stuff that I find most interesting. So, and I'll get to that. Here's another of the famous Vassmuth drawings, renderings of 1910-11. And here we've got not just things within the pictorial space going out, but things that are outside coming in. So you can see the message is the frame is just an artificial thing, that space is one. And he's doing everything he can to break that down, to erase that, to dissolve it, to blur it, right? And if you think about it, that's the nature of the real world, right? That things are not really separated, everything is connected. But it gets very specific. So here we go, here's the conventional picture frame, right? Here's the lie, here's the real world. Here's Hiroshige's prints, and he starts to muddy the waters, right? It's blurring the line by things within the frame being the frame. So you feel like, well, there's no real separation. And here's some of Wright's renderings then. Things outside the frame are encroaching, and things inside the frame are going out. That's not supposed to happen, right? Wright saw space as one, right? Two-dimensionally. I'm going to show you one example, but the famous art glass windows do something very similar. Instead of seeing a big rectangle here, right, because of this artificial foliage, this abstract foliage within the pictorial, right, it's kind of hard to know, well, there's some real foliage behind there, but then there's this artificial foliage. That becomes the frame for the view outside, not the artificial rectangle. Okay? So he's dissolving, he's starting to take that into architecture. There's a direct relationship between Hiroshige's prints, Wright's renderings, and Wright's windows. So here we go, conventional window frame, Hiroshige's picture frames, yes, and then Wright's picture frames, where he's, again, putting his abstract interpretations of natural objects, just as Hiroshige used tree trunks and vegetation, foliage, right, inside to muddy the waters and make the hard line between inside and out, right, inside the picture frame and outside, in this case, inside and outside the building. And it gets even more specific. So the architectural frame, the plan. Here is falling water, and falling water is anything but a box, right? Everybody knows about Frank Lloyd Wright's destruction of the box. Well, now you know where it came from, right? It comes from, before it's a three-dimensional box, it's a two-dimensional frame. They're both spatial. It's just one dimension different. So three-dimensionally, right, the building breaks all the rules. It goes out into the landscape, and the landscape comes in. And he's deliberately in three dimensions then blurring the separation. But it begins in two dimensions, and it begins, I think, with looking at Hiroshige's prints in particular and seeing how he's got rid of the frame, right? And he's starting to have space continuous. Here we are at the second Jacobs house, right? This is a famous fish pond that went in between the two. They very sensibly filled it in, right? It's Wisconsin, it's cold. But the fish originally could swim in between when they weren't frozen, right? So, but Wright is deliberately blurring things that are outside shouldn't be inside, and things that are inside are being outside. He's definitely saying inside, outside, architecture, nature. Is there really a difference? Why are these things so separate, right? So here we go. Here's the picture frame, right? The very sharp separation of pictorial space or architectural space and natural space. Here's the blurring in Wright's renderings, and here's the blurring in architectural terms. In a plan then, elements that start off inside shoot out, well past the envelope of the building. Elements that should be outside, trees are supposed to be outside, right? They're not supposed to be inside buildings. They end up kind of wrapped up with the building. I'll show you in a minute. You also have this sort of gray area, quite literally, where is it in or is it out? Yes. So assimilation, Here's Wright describing Japanese buildings, right, like the rocks and trees grew in their places. What does that mean? Well, things like this. This is a Shinto shrine, the typical location for a Shinto shrine, which for those who don't know then, were built to placate natural spirits. So natural spirits were scary. They needed to be placated, otherwise bad things could happen. So if you had an exceptionally old tree or strange rock or a waterfall, you would build a shrine and give offerings, and hopefully that kami, that spirit, would take care of you. So that's why Shinto shrines, not Buddhist buildings, but Shinto, are almost always found in these peculiar locations. It's not coincidental, I think, that Wright said, well, most architects want to build on flat sites. Give me the messy ones. Give me things like falling water and odd locations, right, that I can really, right? So this notion of buildings that deliberately seek out oddities, eruptions in the landscape, right, that's a connection, I think, to Shinto. And in particular to the window on that would have been the prints like this. A building over a waterfall. Where have I seen that before? Okay, so I don't know, but for most architects before falling water, this was insane. You do not build buildings over things like that. Oh, yes, you do. You do in some cultures, right? Deliberately. Here's Wright. Buildings and trees don't go together, right? Trees are supposed to be outside buildings. Well, not necessarily, right? This is the Winslow can't say it, the stables behind the Winslow house. And here's Wright long before, 2 decades, maybe 3 decades, 1893. When was the Esprit Nouveau Pavilion? 21? Can somebody help me? I can't do the math. But it's a long time before Le Corbusier had that tree growing through his modernist, at least 2 or 3 decades, okay? So this assimilation, a direct assimilation, saying I'm part of this place, I belong here, I'm going to take part of the natural part of that place and I'm going to make it part of me, right? The building as the organism then. Here we go, falling water again. Wright could have easily located these beams, spaced them in such a way to avoid the tree, of course, but no, he puts it there deliberately and then has it take a detour to make the point that the tree was there first and that now, okay, if he'd done the first thing and just spaced them sensibly, right, you'd never know. But when that tree died, and not surprisingly it did, I think at least twice, right, even after it died, you'd see that, and anyone who knew, right, would go, okay, I get it, right? In other words, the architectural organism has been marked by that, right? It's actually, that tree, alive or dead, is part of the architecture and will be forever as long as the architecture is there. The rock that the Kaufmans used to picnic on over the waterfall is even more permanent, I hope. And here it is, it's erupting through the floor of falling water so that the building or the natural place has become part, right? The architectural organism is part of its place. You can't move falling water, apart from being rather technically difficult, right? Because it's impaled on this rock, but it belongs absolutely to its place. You can't move it 6 inches one way or the other. Right. It's like a tree or some other natural thing that has grown in its place. So Wright reckoned that the Japanese print was pretty profound in its influence, and I think he was right. Thank you.